Repeat. 4. Real movement is rather the transference of a state rather than of a thing. By formulating these 4 propositions, we have in reality only been progressively narrowing the interval between the 2 terms, which it is usual to oppose to each other, qualities or sensations, and movements. At first sight, the distance appears impassable. Qualities are heterogeneous, movements homogeneous, sensations essentially indivisible, escape measurement. Movements, always divisible, are distinguished by calculable differences of direction and velocity. We are fain to put qualities in the form of sensations in consciousness, while movements are supposed to take place independently of us in space. These movements, compounded together, we confess, will never yield anything but movements. Our consciousness, though incapable of coming into touch with them, yet by a mysterious process is set to translate them into sensations, which afterwards project themselves into space and come to overlie, we do not know how, the movements they translate. Hence, 2 different worlds, incapable of commuting otherwise than by a miracle, on the one hand that of motion in space, on the other that of consciousness with sensations. Now certainly, the difference is irreducible, as we have shown in an earlier work, between quality on the one hand and pure quantity on the other. But this is just the question. Do real movements present merely differences of quantity, or are they not quality itself? Vibrating, so to speak, internally, and beating time for its own existence through an often incalculable number of moments. Motion, as studied in mechanics, is but an abstraction or a symbol, a common measure, a common denominator, permitting the comparison of all real movements with each other. But these movements, regarded in themselves, are indivisibles which occupy duration, involve a before and an after, and link together the successive moments of time by a thread of variable quality which cannot be without some likeness to the continuity of our own consciousness. May we not conceive, for instance, that the irreducibility of 2 perceived colors is due mainly to the narrow duration in which they are contracted, the billions of vibrations which they execute in one of our movements? If we could stretch out this duration, that is to say, live it at a slower rhythm, should we not, as the rhythm slowed down, see these colors pale and lengthen into successive impressions, still colored, no doubt, but nearer and nearer to coincidence with pure vibrations? In cases where the rhythm of the movement is slow enough to tally with the habits of our consciousness, as in the case of the deep notes of the musical scale, for instance, we do not feel that the quality perceived analyses itself into repeated and successive vibrations, bound together by an inner continuity? That which usually hinders this mutual approach of motion and quality is the acquired habit of attaching movement to elements, atoms, or whatnot, which interpose their solidity between the movement itself and the quality into which it contracts. As our daily experience shows us bodies in motion, it appears to us that there ought to be, in order to sustain the elementary movements to which qualities may be reduced, diminutive bodies or corpuscles. Motion becomes then for our imagination no more than an accident, a series of positions, a change of relations, and as it is a law of our representation that in the stable drives away the unstable, the important and central element for us becomes the atom, between the successive positions of which movement then becomes a mere link. But not only has this conception the inconvenience of merely carrying over to the atom all the problems raised by matter. Not only does it wrongly set up as an absolute that division of matter which is, in our view, hardly anything but an outward projection of human needs, it also renders unintelligible the process by which we grasp in perception, at one and the same time, a state of our consciousness and a reality independent of ourselves. This mixed character of our immediate perception, this appearance of a realized contradiction, is the principal theoretical reason that we have for believing in an external world that does not coincide absolutely with our perception. As it is overlooked in the doctrine that regards sensation as entirely heterogeneous with movements, of which sensation is then supposed to be only a translation into the world of consciousness, this doctrine ought, it would seem, to confine itself to sensations, which it had indeed begun by setting up as the actual data, and not add to them movements which, having no possible contact with them, are no longer anything but their useless duplicate. Realism, so understood, is self-destructive. Indeed, we have no choice, if our belief is a more or less homogeneous substratum of sensible qualities has any ground. If our belief in a more or less homogeneous substratum of sensible qualities has any ground, this can only be found in an act which makes us Caesar divine in quality itself, something which goes beyond sensation, as if this sensation itself were pregnant with details suspected, yet unperceived. Its objectivity, that is to say, what it contains over and above what it yields up, must then consist, as we have foreshadowed, precisely in the immense multiplicity of the movements which it executes, so to speak, within itself as a chrysalis. Motionless on the surface, in its very depth it lives and vibrates. As a matter of fact, no one represents to himself the relation between quantity and quality in any other way. To believe in realities distinct from that which is perceived is above all to recognize that the order of our perceptions depends on them and not on us. There must be, then, within the perceptions which fill a given moment, the reason of what will happen in the following moment. And mechanism only formulates this belief with more precision when it affirms that the states of matter can be deduced from one from the other. It is true that this deduction is possible only if we discover, beneath the apparent heterogeneity of sensible qualities, homogeneous elements which lend themselves to calculation. But on the other hand, if these elements are external to the qualities of which they are meant to explain the regular order, they can no longer render the service demanded of them, because then the qualities must be supposed to come to overlie them by a kind of miracle, and cannot correspond to them unless we bring in some pre-established harmony. So, do what we will, we cannot avoid placing those movements within these qualities, in the form of internal vibrations, and then considering the vibrations as less homogeneous, and the qualities as less heterogeneous than they appear. And lastly, attributing the difference of aspect in the two terms to the necessity which lies upon what may be called an endless multiplicity of contracting into duration too narrow to permit of the separation of its moments. We must insist on this last point, to which we have already alluded elsewhere, and which we regard as essential. The duration lived by our consciousness is the duration with which our own determined rhythm, a duration very different from the time of the physicist, which can store up in a given interval as great a number of phenomena as we please. In the space of a second, red light, the light which has the longest wavelength, and of which, consequently, the vibrations are the least frequent, accomplishes 400 billions of successive vibrations. If we would form some idea of this number, we should have to separate the vibrations sufficiently to allow our consciousness to count them, or at least to record explicitly their succession, and we should then have to inquire how many days or months or years the succession would occupy. Now, the smallest interval of empty time which we can detect equals, according to Exner, 1/500th of a second, and it is even doubtful whether we can perceive in succession several intervals as short as this. Let us admit, however, that we can go on doing so indefinitely. Let us imagine, in a word, a consciousness which should watch the succession of 400 billions of vibrations, each instantaneous, and each separated from the next only by the 1/500th of a second necessary to distinguish them. A very simple calculation shows that more than 25,000 years would elapse before the conclusion of the operation. Thus, the sensation of red light, experienced by us in the course of a second, corresponds in itself to a succession of phenomena which, separately distinguished in our duration with the greatest possible economy of time, would occupy more than 250 centuries of our history. Is this conceivable? We must distinguish here between our duration and time in general. In our duration, the duration which our consciousness perceives, a given interval can only contain a limited number of phenomena of which we are aware. Do we conceive that this content can increase? And when we speak of an infinitely divisible time, is it our own duration that we are thinking of?